Picture this. A knight in shining armor charges wildly across a battlefield, screaming at the top of his lungs, completely alone against a sea of enemies. This is how most people imagine Crusader warfare. But the reality was far more calculated, disciplined, and brutal than any film has ever shown. Today, we're diving deep into the blood-soaked truth of how Crusaders actually fought their battles in the medieval world. By the end of this video, you'll understand why everything Hollywood has taught you about medieval warfare is completely wrong. When you think of Crusader combat, forget everything you've seen on screen. These weren't reckless warriors charging blindly into death. They were methodical, organized fighting machines who understood that survival depended on discipline, not individual heroics. An Arabian warrior named Usama ibn Munki, who actually fought against the Crusaders, complained about his enemies in a way that might surprise you. He said, of all men, the Franks are the most cautious in warfare. Cautious. Not brave, not fierce, but cautious. That tells us something crucial about how these battles really unfolded. But here's where it gets fascinating. This caution wasn't cowardice. It was the foundation of the most devastating military tactic the medieval world had ever seen. The Crusaders had turned warfare into a science, and their enemies knew it. The secret weapon of Crusader armies wasn't courage or religious fervor alone. It was the shock charge, a devastating tactical maneuver that required incredible coordination and timing. Picture hundreds of heavily armored knights thundering across a battlefield in perfect formation, their lances lowered in unison like a moving wall of death. But here's what makes this terrifying. It only worked if every single rider maintained their position. One knight breaking formation could collapse the entire charge and turn victory into massacre. These weren't individual warriors seeking glory. They were tactical units called conroys, small groups of knights who trained together, fought together, and often died together. Multiple conroys would combine to form larger battalions, creating a military machine that could adapt to almost any battlefield situation. The proof of their sophistication lies in one of the most remarkable military achievements in medieval history. When Crusader armies first encountered Muslim horse archers, they faced a completely alien form of warfare. These mounted enemies would rain arrows down on them while staying just out of reach, a tactic that had destroyed countless armies before. But rather than break apart under this pressure, the Crusaders did something extraordinary. They studied Byzantine military tactics and successfully adopted them almost immediately. This wasn't luck or desperation. This was the work of highly trained, intelligent military professionals who understood that adaptation meant survival. In fact, historical records show that Crusader commanders would actually pay captured Muslim soldiers for information about enemy tactics. They turned warfare into an academic study, constantly evolving their methods based on what they learned from both victories and defeats. Now, let's talk about what these warriors actually wore into battle. Because the reality was far more brutal than any costume designer could imagine. A typical Crusader soldier during the First Crusade wore a coat covered in metal scales attached to leather or cloth. Over this went a chainmail shirt with long sleeves, hand protection, and a collar that could mean the difference between life and death. On his head sat a cone-shaped helmet attached with leather straps, often featuring a nose guard that gave him the appearance of some armored bird of prey. But here's where things get interesting. This equipment, designed for European warfare, was completely unsuited to the scorching heat of the Middle East. Imagine marching across desert sand while wearing what amounted to a metal oven. The Crusaders quickly learned to adapt, adopting lighter chain mail and adding cotton quilted caps under their helmets to deal with the brutal sun. The weight of this equipment tells its own story. A fully armed Crusader carried so much metal that swift movement became nearly impossible. Recent studies have calculated that a knight in full gear carried between 60 to 80 pounds of equipment. Their heavy broadswords, lances, and armor created warriors who could devastate enemies in close combat, but struggled with mobility and endurance. This meant that every battle became a race against time. Could they close with the enemy before exhaustion set in? Could they maintain their formations while weighed down like pack animals? The answer often determined who lived and who died. Archaeological evidence from medieval battlefields reveals something crucial about where these warriors aimed their weapons. Excavations at sites like the Battle of Toten show that most soldiers died from multiple severe head wounds. This makes perfect sense when you understand medieval armor. Since chain mail and plate protected the torso, the head became the primary target. Stepping onto a medieval battlefield without a helm, it was essentially suicide, which is why even the poorest soldiers found ways to protect their skulls. But the targeting wasn't random. Medieval combat manuals, which have survived to this day, show specific techniques for exploiting weaknesses in armor. Crusaders were taught to aim for the gaps at joints, to thrust upward under the arm, or to use specialized weapons like war hammers that could crush armor through blunt force trauma. The archaeological record from the Crusades shows us something even more disturbing. Many Crusader remains found in the Holy Land show evidence of torture and mutilation after death. This wasn't just warfare, it was psychological terror designed to break enemy morale, but individual combat was only part of the Crusader military machine. These armies faced a challenge that would test every aspect of their organization: siege warfare. Unlike the quick, decisive field battles we see in films, most Crusader campaigns revolved around the slow, grinding process of taking fortified cities. Consider the siege of Acre during the Third Crusade, a brutal affair that lasted almost 2 years. The city was surrounded by massive battlements and defended by towers that seemed to scrape the sky. When the Crusader army of Guy de Lusignan arrived, they didn't immediately assault the walls. Instead, they did something that shows the methodical nature of medieval warfare. They dug in. The Crusaders surrounded Acre with their own fortifications, creating ditches and moats that turned the siege into a city within a city. They understood that taking a fortified position required patience, engineering, and overwhelming resources. When reinforcements arrived from the west, they brought not just fresh soldiers, but the materials needed to build massive siege engines. The French contingent tunneled beneath one of Acre's great towers, a process that took months of dangerous underground work. Meanwhile, other Crusaders constructed catapults so large they gave them names. The French called one of their siege engines God's Own Sling, a machine capable of hurling stones heavy enough to crack fortress walls. Archaeological excavations at Acre have revealed the remains of these siege engines. The engineering was so sophisticated that some historians argue it represents the peak of medieval military technology. These weren't crude catapults. They were precision instruments of destruction that required teams of engineers to operate. But the real key to Crusader success at Acre wasn't their siege weapons or their courage. It was logistics. While Saladin's army tried desperately to break the siege from outside, Crusader ships continued arriving with supplies, reinforcements, and ammunition. The Muslims found themselves caught between the city's defenders and the Crusader siege lines, unable to effectively support either position. This brings us to perhaps the most important aspect of Crusader warfare that no film has ever properly shown: the absolutely critical role of supply lines and logistics. Medieval Europe had lost the Roman skills of military logistics centuries earlier, and Crusader armies had to relearn these lessons in the harsh deserts of the Middle East. The reality was simple and brutal. An army could carry about a week's worth of food for the soldiers, but nothing for the horses and pack animals. These beasts needed 4 to 6 hours of grazing every single day, which meant that every march had to be planned around finding adequate grass and water. Many Crusader armies were defeated not by enemy swords, but by empty stomachs and poisoned wells. Muslim commanders like Saladin understood this weakness perfectly and used it as their most devastating weapon. When Richard the Lionheart arrived in the Holy Land during the Third Crusade, he brought something that set him apart from previous Crusader leaders: meticulous planning. While earlier armies had starved in the desert, Richard arranged for supply ships to follow his forces as they marched along the coast. His success came not from superior fighting skills, but from superior organization. But Saladin was equally brilliant at this deadly game of logistics. When Richard finally attempted to march inland toward Jerusalem, he discovered that the Muslim leader had systematically destroyed everything in his path. Wells were poisoned, crops burned, livestock driven away. The countryside had been turned into a barren wasteland where an army could only survive for days before collapsing from starvation. This forced Richard into one of the most difficult decisions of his military career. Despite having one of the best supplied and most disciplined armies of the entire Crusader period, he realized that besieging Jerusalem would mean watching his men die slowly of hunger and thirst. The two greatest military minds of their generation had effectively checkmated each other through logistics alone. The contrast with Muslim military organization was stark and often decisive. While Crusader armies struggled with supply lines stretched across thousands of miles, Muslim forces operated with sophisticated logistics networks using thousands of camels and mules. These supply columns included not just food and weapons, but doctors and medical equipment, giving Muslim armies a crucial advantage in the brutal wars of attrition that defined Crusader conflicts. But what happened when all the planning, all the logistics, and all the tactical formations finally came together in actual combat? Recent archaeological discoveries have given us a disturbing window into the reality of medieval battle. At Sidon Castle in Lebanon, archaeologists uncovered the remains of soldiers who died during 13th century attacks on the fortress. These weren't clean deaths from Hollywood sword fights. The skeletons tell a story of absolute brutality that no film has ever dared to show. Some bodies bore sword wounds across the backs of their necks, suggesting they were captives executed by decapitation after the battle had ended. Others had been cut down from behind while fleeing, their spines severed by pursuing enemies. These weren't glorious warrior deaths. They were the panicked final moments of young men who realized their formations had collapsed and death was inevitable. The wounds covering these medieval soldiers reveal something crucial about Crusader combat. When disciplined formations broke down, when the careful tactical planning failed, medieval warfare became a chaotic slaughter where survival often depended more on luck than skill. This archaeological evidence destroys one of the most persistent myths about Crusader warfare. These weren't individual heroes dueling with enemy champions while armies watched respectfully from the sidelines. Real medieval combat was a desperate struggle where soldiers targeted the most vulnerable points on their enemies' bodies with ruthless efficiency. The real story of Crusader warfare isn't found in tales of individual heroism or divine intervention. It's found in the meticulous records of supply manifests, the careful placement of siege engines, and the grim archaeological evidence of what happened when medieval military science met the brutal realities of combat. These weren't the romantic knights of legend. They were professional soldiers who turned warfare into a science, who understood that victory came through discipline, organization, and brutal efficiency. Remember the poisoned wells and the careful supply lines. Remember the shock charges that required perfect coordination and the siege engines with names like God's own sling. Remember the young soldiers whose bones still bear the marks of wounds they received 800 years ago. That's how Crusaders really fought, and now you know the truth behind the legend.